She always chose the seat in the back row. Not because anyone told her to sit there. Not because her name was written on it. She just felt safer there. From the back, she could see everyone without being seen too much herself. It was easier that way. The community hall was already half full when she slipped inside that evening. The lights were warm and bright, and soft music played through old speakers near the stage. People were talking in small groups, laughing, fixing their clothes, checking their phones. It was one of those local talent nights where anyone could perform, sing, dance, tell a story, or play an instrument. She held the strap of her small bag tightly as she walked down the side aisle. Inside that bag were folded sheets of music, slightly worn at the edges. She had printed them months ago. She had practiced from them so many times that she didn't even need them anymore. But carrying them made her feel steady, like holding onto something familiar. She reached the back row and sat down quietly. No one really noticed her. A few students from her school were sitting near the middle rows. They were dressed confidently, talking loudly, already planning to record videos for social media. She recognized their faces, but she didn't walk over. She never did. Since her mother passed away last year, she had changed. Before that, she used to smile more. She used to raise her hand in class. She used to talk about music openly, without feeling embarrassed. Her mother had been the only person who truly listened when she played. Their house was small and the piano was old. Some keys were slightly chipped. A few notes sounded softer than they should have. But every evening after dinner, her mother would sit beside her and say, "Play it again." Not because it was perfect. Not because she demanded it. But because she loved hearing her daughter try. "You don't play with your hands," her mother once told her gently. "You play with your heart." That's what people remember. She had never forgotten that. Now, sitting in the back of the hall, she looked at the stage. A shiny black piano stood at the center under a spotlight. It looked bigger and newer than the one at home. For a moment her chest tightened. What if the keys felt different? What if her fingers slipped? What if she forgot the middle part? She swallowed those thoughts. She didn't come here to be perfect. She came because tonight meant something. On the stage, the event organizer stepped up to the microphone and welcomed everyone. The crowd clapped politely. The list of performers was nearly full, but there were still a few open spots. "If anyone else would like to perform," the organizer announced, "please come up and add your name before we begin." Her heart started beating faster. This was the moment. She stared at the small table near the stage where a clipboard rested. Only a few steps separated her from it. But those steps felt longer than the entire walk from her house. What if they laughed? What if someone asked her where she had performed before? She had never performed publicly. She had only ever played in her living room with one person listening. She thought about staying in her seat. No one would blame her. No one even expected her to perform. She could simply watch, clap for others, and go home quietly. But then a memory rose in her mind. It was from the hospital. The room had been white and still. Machines made soft sounds in the background. Her mother's voice was weaker than before, but her eyes were still warm. "Promise me," her mother had whispered, holding her hand gently, "that you won't hide your music." She had nodded through tears. "I promise." Now that promise felt heavy and strong at the same time. She took a slow breath and stood up. The chair made a soft scraping sound against the floor, louder than she expected. A few heads turned briefly, then turned back. She walked down the side aisle again, this time toward the stage. Each step felt unsteady, but she didn't stop. When she reached the table, the organizer looked up. "Yes?" they asked kindly, though slightly rushed. I would like to play the piano," she said softly. The organizer glanced at the list. "Have you performed before?" She hesitated. "No, but I've been practicing for a long time." The organizer studied her for a second. She knew what they saw. A quiet girl, simple clothes, nervous hands. Not someone who looked like a confident performer. "What piece will you play?" they asked. She named the song. It was an old, emotional melody. Not flashy. Not dramatic. just beautiful and full of feeling. The organizer nodded slowly. All right, we'll see if we have time. She picked up the pen and wrote her name carefully on the bottom of the list. As she turned around, she noticed a few students nearby whispering. One of them gave a small laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. She's performing? Someone murmured. I didn't even know she played, another replied. She's so quiet. This should be interesting. The words weren't shouted, but they carried. Her cheeks grew warm. For a second, she wished she could erase her name from the paper. She imagined going back and saying she changed her mind. But she didn't. She walked back to her seat in the last row and sat down again, this time with her hands resting tightly on her lap. The program began. One by one, performers went up on stage. A group sang a popular song. A boy played the guitar confidently. A girl performed a fast piano piece that made the audience clap loudly. With each performance, her stomach twisted more. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe they were right to laugh. She stared at the stage lights and remembered another night at home. The power had gone out during a storm. The house was dark except for a few candles. Rain hit the windows loudly. She had been scared, but her mother had smiled and said, "Play something soft. It will calm the storm inside you." She had played by candlelight, the notes blending with the sound of rain. When she finished, her mother had closed her eyes and whispered, "One day, others will hear this too." That memory steadied her breathing. She wasn't playing to impress the students in the middle rows. She wasn't playing to compete with anyone. She was playing for the woman who believed in her before anyone else did. Halfway through the event, she noticed something else. Even though some performers were confident, not all of them were perfect. A few missed notes. A few forgot lyrics. But the audience still clapped. It wasn't about perfection. It was about courage. She realized something simple but powerful. Everyone on that stage had once been nervous too. The only difference was that they chose to walk up there anyway. She looked at the piano again. From the back row, it didn't look as intimidating anymore. It looked like an opportunity. The whispers from earlier still echoed faintly in her mind, but they no longer felt as sharp. They were just sounds, and sounds could fade. She placed her hand over her chest and felt her heartbeat. "I won't hide," she whispered to herself. The night was still long. Her name was still at the bottom of that list. She didn't know if they would actually call her. She didn't know if there would be enough time. But for the first time since her mother passed away, she felt something close to hope. Not loud hope. Not dramatic hope. Just a small, steady light inside her. And this time, she wasn't sitting in the back because she wanted to disappear. She was sitting there because she was gathering the courage to stand up again. The program moved forward, and the hall slowly grew louder with confidence. Each performer seemed more relaxed than the last. Laughter came easily now. Applause came quickly. The atmosphere felt light and entertaining. From the back row, she watched it all while sitting very still. Her name was still written at the bottom of the list. She knew that because she had looked twice when she returned to her seat. It was there in neat handwriting, smaller than the others but clear. She kept wondering if she had made a mistake. Two girls from her school walked past her row during a short break. They were holding drinks and talking in low voices. When they noticed her, they slowed down slightly. "You're really going to play?" one of them asked, raising her eyebrows. She nodded softly. The other girl gave a small laugh. "I didn't even know you play piano." "I do," she replied, her voice calm but quiet. "Well, good luck," the first girl said. But the tone didn't sound supportive. It sounded amused. As they walked away, she heard one of them whisper, "This should be interesting." The words weren't cruel enough to be called bullying, but they were sharp enough to sting. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were steady, but she could feel the tension inside her chest. She flexed her fingers slowly, remembering the way they moved across the keys at home. At home, there was no audience. At home, there were no whispers. There was only her and the piano. Another performer finished a lively dance, and the crowd cheered loudly. The organizer stepped back onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. "We have time for a few more performances. they announced. Her stomach tightened. A few more names were called. A boy told a short joke. Someone sang a slow song. The list was almost finished now. She tried to focus on her breathing. Inhale. Exhale. She reminded herself why she was here. It wasn't for attention. It wasn't for praise. It wasn't to prove anyone wrong. It was for a promise. But promises don't make fear disappear. They just make you face it. Near the front rows, someone turned around and looked toward her. It was one of the students who had laughed earlier. He leaned toward his friend and said something while glancing back at her again. Both of them smiled. Her face felt warm. For a brief second, she imagined what it would be like to stand up and say she changed her mind. No one would force her to perform. The organizer would simply move on. The night would continue without her. She would go home quietly. No embarrassment. No risk. But also no music. The thought of that felt heavier than the fear. She remembered another evening from months ago. It was the first time she tried to play after her mother was gone. The house felt too silent. The piano looked different without someone sitting beside her. She had pressed one key, and the sound filled the room in a way that made her chest ache. She almost closed the lid and walked away. But then she heard her mother's voice in her mind, gentle and steady. Play it again. So she did. And again. And slowly, the pain turned into something softer. Not gone. Just different. Back in the hall, the organizer cleared their throat. "We have one last open spot," they said, looking down at the clipboard. Her heart began to pound so loudly she was sure the person next to her could hear it. The organizer scanned the page. "It looks like we have someone who signed up a little later." A pause. Her name was spoken into the microphone. The sound of it echoed through the speakers and into every corner of the hall. For a second, everything felt frozen. A few heads turned. Some people searched the room to see who was standing up. A whisper traveled through the crowd. "That's her. She's actually doing it." Her legs felt weak as she stood. The chair behind her made another scraping sound, louder than before. She wished it hadn't. Every step toward the stage felt longer than the last. The floor seemed too open. The lights seemed too bright. She could feel eyes on her from every direction. Halfway down the aisle, someone near the middle row let out a small chuckle. It wasn't loud enough to stop the program, but it was loud enough for her to hear. "Good luck," someone muttered, in a tone that didn't feel kind. Her throat tightened. For a split second, she almost turned around. But then she imagined something else. She imagined her mother sitting in the front row. Not sick, not weak, just smiling the way she used to, with her hands folded gently in her lap. That image gave her strength. She reached the stage steps. The organizer offered a polite smile, though it looked slightly unsure. "You can take your time," they said quietly. She nodded and walked toward the piano. Up close, it looked even bigger than before. The black surface reflected the stage lights. The bench felt firmer than the one at home. She sat down slowly. The microphone stand was moved slightly closer. The room grew quieter, but not completely silent. There were still a few whispers floating in the air. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment. She needed just 1 second to breathe. From the corner of her eye, she saw someone in the audience leaning toward their friend again. A faint laugh followed. Her chest tightened once more. Why did people laugh before hearing a single note? Why was quietness mistaken for weakness? She didn't have answers. She only had music. She placed her fingers gently on the keys without pressing them yet. The smooth surface felt different from her piano at home, but still familiar enough. The room was waiting. Some were curious. Some were doubtful. Some were simply ready for the night to end. She closed her eyes briefly. Inside her mind, she wasn't on a stage. She was back in her living room. The curtains were slightly open. Evening light was falling softly across the piano. Her mother was sitting beside her, listening carefully. "You don't have to be loud to be strong," her mother had once said. "Let the music speak." Her eyes opened. She could still feel nervousness in her body. Her heartbeat was fast. Her palms were slightly damp. But beneath the fear, there was something steady. determination. The whispers in the audience slowly faded into silence. The crowd seemed to sense that the moment was about to begin. Someone coughed in the back. A chair creaked. Then stillness. She knew that once she pressed the first key, there would be no turning back. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in her memory. The doubtful looks, the raised eyebrows, the quiet jokes. They had ridiculed her simple request. All she had asked for was a chance. And now she had it. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. One deep breath. In that breath was grief. In that breath was courage. In that breath was love. The entire hall felt suspended in a fragile silence. And just before the first note was about to break it, she whispered something so soft that no one else could hear. "This is for you." Then her finger moved. Her finger pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost fragile. It floated into the air and settled gently across the hall. For a brief second, it felt like the note might disappear without anyone truly hearing it. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Someone near the back cleared their throat. The moment felt delicate, like glass that could crack with the slightest noise. Then she pressed the second key. This time, the sound carried more clearly. It blended with the first note and formed the beginning of a melody. Slow, careful, honest. She kept her eyes on the keys. Her hands were no longer shaking. The whispers that had followed her earlier slowly faded. The audience began to quiet down, not because someone told them to, but because something in the sound made them listen. The melody wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It didn't try to impress anyone with complicated movements. It simply told a story. Her story. As she moved into the next part of the song, her fingers began to glide more naturally. The piano no longer felt foreign. Felt like an old friend. In the third row, one of the students who had laughed earlier stopped leaning back in his chair. He straightened slightly. His smile faded. Near the aisle, a woman folded her arms, then slowly unfolded them, giving her full attention to the stage. The music grew deeper. It wasn't perfect in a technical way. A trained professional might have found small flaws. But no one in that hall was counting mistakes. They were feeling something instead. Each note carried emotion. Not loud emotion. Not dramatic. Just real. She remembered practicing this same piece late at night, when the house felt too quiet. She had played it slowly at first, stopping whenever her vision blurred with tears. Over time, she learned to keep playing even when her chest felt tight. Now that strength was in her hands. The middle section of the song approached, the part she used to struggle with. It required more movement, more control. At home, she had practiced it over and over until her fingers memorized every shift. As she reached that part, her heart beat faster for a moment. But her hands didn't hesitate. They moved confidently, pressing the keys with steady pressure. The melody rose slightly, carrying more power than before. A quiet wave of surprise passed through the room. Someone in the audience leaned forward. The organizer standing near the side of the stage crossed their arms slowly, watching more carefully now. She didn't see any of this. She was lost in the music. In her mind, she could see her mother again. Not in a hospital bed. Not tired. But standing in the kitchen doorway at home, listening with that soft, proud smile. Again, her mother would say after she finished practicing, "Play it one more time," and she always had. Back in the hall, the melody softened again, flowing into a gentle bridge. Her fingers barely lifted from the keys. The sound became lighter, almost like a whisper. The entire audience was silent now. No phones glowing. No chairs scraping. No laughter. Only music. A man in the front row blinked quickly, as if surprised by his own reaction. A younger child sitting beside him stopped fidgeting and stared at the stage. There was something about the way she played. It didn't demand attention. It invited it. The final section of the song approached, the part that meant the most to her. This was the part her mother loved most. She remembered one specific evening. The window had been open, and cool air had drifted into the living room. She had played this section slowly, carefully. When she finished, her mother didn't clap. She simply placed a hand over her heart and said, "That part feels like hope. Now, sitting on a different bench, under bright lights, she let that same feeling guide her. Her fingers pressed the keys with more strength, but still with control. The melody expanded, filling every corner of the hall. The sound was no longer fragile. It was steady and sure. The students who had whispered earlier were no longer whispering. One of them lowered their gaze, not out of embarrassment, but out of quiet reflection. The music swelled gently, then softened again. Felt like breathing, rising and falling, rising and falling. She wasn't thinking about who had laughed. She wasn't thinking about whether she looked confident. She wasn't thinking about anything except the story flowing through her hands. Grief, love, memory, promise, all of it blended into sound. As she approached the final notes, time seemed to slow down. Each key she pressed felt meaningful. Each pause felt intentional. She allowed the last few notes to linger slightly longer than usual. She let them settle into the silence before moving to the final chord. Her hands pressed down together. The final chord resonated through the hall, deep and clear. And then she lifted her fingers. Silence. Not awkward silence. Not bored silence. Stunned silence. The sound of the last note faded slowly, as if it didn't want to leave. For a moment no one moved. She kept her eyes on the keys, her hands resting gently in her lap now. She could hear her own breathing. Had she done it too softly? Had she done it too slowly? The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then, somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap. It wasn't loud. It was steady. Another pair joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. Not polite applause. Not forced applause. Real applause. Some people stood up. The sound echoed against the walls, louder than anything that had filled the room that night. She slowly lifted her eyes from the keys and looked out at the audience. The same faces that had once shown doubt now showed something different. Respect, surprise, even admiration. She noticed one of the girls who had laughed earlier wiping under her eye quickly, pretending to fix her makeup. The organizer gave her a nod that felt genuine this time. Her chest felt light, almost weightless. She hadn't played to prove them wrong, but somehow she had. She stood up slowly from the bench. The applause continued. It washed over her, warm and unexpected. She gave a small, shy bow. As she stepped away from the piano, she felt something shift inside her. The fear that had once gripped her so tightly was no longer in control. In its place was quiet confidence. Not loud confidence. Not attention-seeking confidence. Just the simple knowledge that she had honored her promise. As she walked down the stage steps, the applause slowly softened but didn't disappear immediately. A few people reached out to lightly pat her shoulder as she passed. She returned to the back row, but this time it felt different. She wasn't hiding anymore. She sat down gently, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her heart was still beating fast, but now it carried relief instead of fear. The laughter from earlier felt distant, almost unreal. In its place was the memory of that final chord filling the room. And somewhere deep inside, she felt it clearly. Her mother would have been proud. The applause did not stop quickly. It rolled through the hall in waves, strong and steady. She stood near the side aisle for a second, unsure where to look. Her face felt warm, and her hands felt light, almost unfamiliar, as if they no longer belonged to the nervous girl who had walked to the stage earlier. She had imagined many possible endings to this night. In most of them, she walked back quietly while people clapped politely out of kindness. In some of them, there was awkward silence. In none of them had she imagined this. People were still standing. The organizer stepped closer to the microphone again, smiling in a way that looked different from before. "That was beautiful," they said sincerely. "Thank you." The crowd responded with another round of applause. She gave a small nod and walked back toward her seat in the last row. But even that felt different now. The same aisle that had felt too long before now seemed shorter. The same faces that had made her nervous were now looking at her with softer expressions. As she passed the middle rows, someone said quietly, "That was amazing." Another voice added, "I didn't expect that." She wasn't sure whether to smile or keep her eyes down, so she did both. A small smile appeared without her planning it. When she reached her chair and sat down, her heart was still beating fast. She placed her hands on her knees and took a deep breath. The piano was still on stage, silent now under the lights. For a moment, she simply listened to the sound of people talking about her performance. It wasn't loud gossip. It wasn't teasing. It was different. "She plays like that at school?" someone asked. "I've never seen her talk that much, but she plays like that?" Another replied. "She must have been practicing for years." She looked down at her fingers. They looked the same as always. Thin, simple, no rings, no nail polish, just hands that had spent hours moving across old keys in a quiet living room. Two girls from earlier slowly approached her row. She recognized them immediately. They had been whispering near the table when she signed up. One of them hesitated before speaking. "Hey," she said softly. She looked up. "That was really good." The words sounded honest, not forced. "Thank you," she replied gently. The other girl shifted her weight. "We didn't know you played like that." She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure what to say. She had never thought about how she played compared to others. She only played because it felt right. "I just practice," she said finally. The girls nodded, almost awkwardly, then returned to their seats. She could feel the difference in the room. Earlier, she had been invisible in a way that felt small. Now, she was visible in a way that felt earned. But the most surprising thing was that she didn't feel proud in a loud way. She didn't feel like celebrating or talking about herself. She just felt calm. The rest of the program continued, but the mood had shifted slightly. The next performer went on stage and people clapped warmly, but there was still a quiet energy lingering in the air from what had just happened. As she sat there, she remembered something small from her childhood. She had once been too afraid to perform in a school assembly. She had cried backstage, convinced she would forget everything. Her mother had knelt down in front of her and said, "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you step forward even when you are." Tonight, she had stepped forward. After the final performer finished, the organizer thanked everyone for coming. People began to stand, gather their belongings, and move toward the exits. Conversations filled the hall again, but now she could hear her name mentioned in some of them. She stood slowly and adjusted the strap of her bag. As she walked toward the door, someone gently touched her arm. She turned and saw an older woman smiling at her. The woman's eyes looked slightly wet. "Excuse me," the woman said kindly. "I just wanted to tell you something." She nodded politely. "The way you played," the woman continued, "it felt like you were telling a story. It reminded me of someone I lost too." Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman placed a hand over her own heart. "Keep playing," she said softly. "Don't ever stop." Those words felt heavier than the applause. Outside, the night air was cool. The sky was dark, dotted with quiet stars. The noise from inside the hall faded as the doors closed behind her. She walked slowly down the steps, breathing in the fresh air. For months after her mother passed away, she had felt like something inside her had dimmed, like a small light had gone out. Tonight, that light flickered again. Not because people clapped, not because they were impressed, but because she had faced something that scared her, and she didn't run. As she walked down the sidewalk, she replayed small moments from the evening in her mind. The laughter before she went on stage, the silence during the first note, the shift in the room as the melody grew stronger, the applause at the end. She realized something simple but powerful. The laughter hadn't destroyed her. It had tested her. And she had answered not with words, but with music. Halfway down the street, she stopped walking for a moment. She looked up at the sky and imagined her mother standing beside her. "I didn't hide," she whispered softly. Cars passed by in the distance. The world kept moving, unaware of what that night had meant to her. But for her, everything felt slightly different. She wasn't suddenly bold. She wasn't suddenly loud or outgoing. She was still the same quiet girl who preferred the back row. But now she knew something she hadn't fully understood before. Her quietness was not weakness. Her softness was not something to laugh at. It was strength shaped in a different way. When she reached her house, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of home greeted her. The piano stood against the wall, just as it always had. She walked toward it slowly. For a second, she simply stared at it. Then she sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys again. The room was silent, but it didn't feel empty. She played the same song once more, softer this time. Not to practice, not to perform, just to feel it. The notes filled the small living room, just like they used to. As she played the final chord, she closed her eyes. In her heart, she could almost hear her mother's voice again. That part feels like hope. A small smile touched her lips. Tonight, the stage had been bigger. The piano had been newer. The audience had been larger. But this moment felt just as important. Because the music was still hers. And no one could ridicule that away. She finished playing and let her hands rest in her lap. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of proving herself. She had already done what she needed to do. She had kept her promise. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The next morning did not feel ordinary. Sunlight came through her window the same way it always did, soft and pale against the wall. The birds outside made their usual sounds. The street was quiet. Nothing in the world looked different. But she felt different. She lay in bed for a few extra minutes, staring at the ceiling. For a second, she wondered if the night before had been a dream. The stage, the silence, the applause, the older woman who had placed a hand over her heart. It all felt too big to be real. Then she remembered the way her fingers had moved without fear during the final part of the song. That part had been real. The warmth in her chest had been real. She slowly got up and got ready for school. As she walked through the hallway later that morning, something unexpected happened. Someone smiled at her first. It was a small thing, just a simple nod from a student passing by. But it had never happened before. Then another voice called out softly, "Hey, you were amazing last night." She turned slightly surprised. "Thanks," she said, still not fully used to hearing praise directed at her. The news had spread faster than she thought. Some students had recorded short clips of the performance. Not to make fun of her, but because they were impressed. By morning, those clips were already being shared in group chats. She didn't check them herself. She wasn't interested in numbers or comments, but she could feel the shift around her. In class, a girl who had once laughed when she signed up for the event sat beside her. "I didn't know you played like that," she said honestly. She shrugged gently. "I don't usually play in front of people." "You should," the girl replied without hesitation. That sentence stayed with her for the rest of the day. You should. For so long, she had kept her music private. It had been something personal, something fragile, something that belonged only to her and her mother. Sharing it had felt risky, but now she understood something new. When she played, she wasn't losing anything. She was giving something. At lunch, a small group gathered around her table. Not a crowd, not loud attention, just a few curious faces. "How long have you been playing?" someone asked. "Since I was little," she answered. "Did someone teach you?" She paused. "My mom showed me the basics. After that, I just practiced." There was no sadness in her voice this time, just truth. The conversation wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't mocking. Felt normal. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible at school. But even more important than that, she didn't feel like she needed their approval anymore. After classes ended, she walked home slowly, letting the cool air brush against her face. She thought about the night before, but not in a dramatic way. She thought about it like someone flipping through meaningful pages in a book. The moment her name was called, the laughter before she played, the silence during the music, the applause after. She realized something simple. If she had let the laughter stop her, none of the rest would have happened. That thought made her stop walking for a moment. How many times had she stayed quiet in the past because she feared being judged? How many chances had she let pass because she didn't want to stand out? The answer made her chest tighten slightly, but instead of regret, she felt motivation. When she reached home, she didn't go straight to her room. She walked to the piano first. She sat down and ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. The instrument looked the same. The room looked the same. But she no longer felt like she was playing only for memory. She began to practice a new piece. Something brighter this time. Something with a gentle rhythm that lifted instead of lingered. Halfway through, she made a small mistake. Her finger slipped slightly. She smiled instead of stopping. Perfection didn't matter as much anymore. Later that evening, there was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she saw the older woman from the event standing there, holding a small container. "I hope you don't mind," the woman said warmly. "I asked around and someone told me where you live. I just wanted to bring this." Inside the container were homemade cookies. She blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to," the woman replied gently. "Last night meant something to me." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. "My daughter used to play piano too," the woman added softly. "Hearing you, it brought back something good." Her throat tightened again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy sadness. It was connection. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly. The woman smiled. "Thank you for playing." After she closed the door, she leaned back against it and exhaled slowly. Music had connected her to someone she had never met before. That realization felt powerful. Later that night, as she sat at her desk finishing homework, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of the students who had laughed when she first signed up. "I'm sorry if we made you uncomfortable yesterday. We didn't know." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "It's okay," and she meant it. Holding on to anger would not change anything. What changed things was courage. The following week, something unexpected happened again. The organizer from the event called her. "We're planning another community evening next month," they said. "Would you consider opening the program this time?" Opening. Not filling a last-minute spot. Not being the extra name at the bottom of a list. Opening. Her heart skipped. I'll think about it," she answered honestly. After the call ended, she sat quietly for a few minutes. The old fear tried to return. What if it doesn't go the same way again? What if people expect too much this time? But then she remembered something important. The applause had not defined her. The music had. Whether people clapped or not, the act of playing with her whole heart was what mattered. She walked to the piano again. She placed her hands on the keys. This time, when she began to play, she didn't imagine only one person listening. She imagined a room full of people. Some supportive, some doubtful, some curious. And she played anyway. Because the night they ridiculed her simple request was no longer just a memory of laughter. It had become a turning point. Not because others changed first, but because she did. She had stepped forward when it would have been easier to sit down. She had pressed the first key when silence felt safer. And now, no matter what stage she stood on in the future, she would remember that feeling. The feeling of choosing courage over comfort. The feeling of honoring a promise. The feeling of knowing that somewhere, beyond applause and beyond doubt, she had made her mother proud. A month passed faster than she expected. The invitation to open the next community evening stayed in her mind every single day. At first, she tried not to think about it too much. She told herself she still had time to decide. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She would say yes. Not because she wanted attention. Not because she wanted applause again. But because she no longer wanted fear to make her choices. The days leading up to the event were different from the first time. She still practiced every evening, but now her practice felt calmer. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't replaying the laughter in her head anymore. She was simply working on the music, shaping it slowly, carefully. This time, she chose a piece that began softly but grew brighter toward the end. Felt like a journey. Felt like her. Sometimes while practicing, She would pause and look at the empty chair beside the piano. For a moment, she would imagine her mother sitting there, listening the way she used to. She didn't feel the same sharp ache anymore. The sadness was still there, but it was gentler now. It felt like a quiet companion instead of a heavy weight. On the day of the event, she stood in front of her mirror and took a slow breath. She wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just something simple and neat. She didn't want to look different. She wanted to feel like herself. When she arrived at the hall, it felt familiar this time. The same warm lights, the same stage, the same black piano waiting under the spotlight. But she wasn't heading to the back row. The organizer greeted her with a genuine smile. "We're glad you're here," they said. She nodded politely. As the audience began to fill the seats, she stood near the side of the stage. She could hear the soft buzz of conversation. She noticed some of the same students from last time. A few of them waved when they saw her. She waved back. There were no whispers now, no quiet laughter, just anticipation. Still, her heart beat fast. Standing behind the curtain, she closed her eyes for a second. She remembered the first night, how her hands had trembled, how small she had felt walking down the aisle, how strong she had felt pressing the final chord. "You don't have to be loud to be strong." The words echoed in her mind. When the organizer stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone, she felt a steady calm settle over her. This time, when her name was announced, the applause came immediately. She walked onto the stage without rushing. The lights were bright, but they didn't blind her. The audience was full, but it didn't scare her. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. For a brief moment, she looked out at the crowd. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She spoke. "Thank you for being here," she said softly into the microphone. Her voice was gentle but clear. "The last time I played here, I was very nervous. But I learned something important. Sometimes the scariest step is the one that changes everything." The hall was quiet. "This piece means a lot to me," she continued. "I hope you feel something when you hear it." She didn't say anything about proving people wrong. She didn't mention the laughter from before. She didn't need to. She turned back to the piano. Her fingers rested on the keys. The first note flowed out smoothly, steady and controlled. The room fell silent almost instantly. This time, she didn't focus only on her own story. She thought about everyone sitting in front of her. Each person had something they carried quietly. Each person had fears they didn't show. Each person had moments when they felt small. She let the music speak to that. The melody rose gently, filling the hall with warmth. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was honest. As she moved into the middle section, her hands glided confidently. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing. In the third row, she noticed the older woman again, sitting with a soft smile and folded hands. That sight alone gave her strength. The music grew brighter, stronger. The notes felt like sunlight after a long night. For the first time in her life, she wasn't playing to remember the past. She was playing for the present. The final section approached and she allowed herself to fully feel it. Not just the love she had lost, not just the promise she had kept, but the person she had become. The last chord rang out clearly. Silence followed, but it was different from before. Felt peaceful. Then applause filled the hall once again. She stood and bowed gently, her heart steady and full. As she walked off the stage, she realized something important. The applause felt nice, but it no longer defined her. After the event ended, several people came up to speak with her. Some thanked her. Some shared short stories about how the music reminded them of someone special. One younger girl said quietly, "I was too scared to sign up tonight, but maybe next time I will." She smiled at her. "Do it," she said gently, "even if you're scared." Later that evening, when she returned home, she didn't rush to the piano immediately. Instead, she sat by the window and looked up at the night sky. The stars looked the same as they had the night of her first performance. But she felt different again. She realized that the biggest change wasn't how others saw her. It was how she saw herself. She was still quiet, still gentle, still someone who preferred listening over speaking. But she was no longer hiding. She stood up and walked to the piano one more time that night. She sat down and played a few soft notes, just for herself. As the melody filled the room, she felt something settle deeply inside her. Peace. She had started this journey because she didn't want to break a promise. But along the way, she found something else. Confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention. The quiet kind that stays even when the room is empty. She finished playing and let her fingers rest on the keys. I didn't hide, she whispered again, just like she had after the first night. And this time, she didn't imagine her mother in the front row of a stage. She felt her presence in something much closer. In her courage, in her music, in her heart. The laughter from that first evening was now just a distant memory. What remained was the sound of the piano, steady and sure. She turned off the lights and walked toward her room, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The girl who once sat in the back row to disappear had learned to walk toward the stage. And she knew now that no matter where life placed her, she would never again let fear silence her simple request. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave note to change everything. And she had already played it.